Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and a very warm welcome to another conversation on the going ons in Russia with four fantastic experts who are joining uh, Digital ORF to present their thoughts, their perspectives, their views. Let me first welcome these wonderful folks who've joined us this Saturday. Max Abrahms, faculty at Northeastern University in political science. Uh, Formidable presence on Twitter, not because of any other reason, but for the fact that he speaks his mind and doesn't toe a ideological line. And we are going to, Max, count on you to do that this evening, this afternoon. Velina, welcome to this conversation. Velina Tchakarova, a visiting senior fellow at ORF, formerly director at the Australian Institute for Strategic Studies, and also someone who runs a boutique geopolitical consulting firm. And of course, Nandan Unnikrishnan, my colleague at ORF, a resident Russia expert for the entire country, but certainly someone who's been running the Eurasia program at ORF for many, many years, someone who did his middle school in Moscow, speaks Russian without any accent, and is teasingly called Nandan Unnikrishnikov at our institute. So, Nandan, let me start with you. What's happening? Who are the key actors? What should all of us be watching at this particular moment when Twitter is going crazy, media is more full of fantasies and fiction rather than facts, and of course, everyone has their own take on how the world is going to unfold tomorrow. So, Nandan, what are we witnessing? Who should we watch?
Okay. Thank you, Samir. Firstly, I think it's a fantastic idea you have had to convene this conversation. Uh, it's very relevant, very timely. First, let me start by introducing the sort of main actors who participated in last Saturday's drama, as it were. Of course, leading the cast was Mr. Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is, this is for the audience, not for the participants here, who was the head of a private military company called Wagner. And he ostensibly mutinied on 24th of June. He claims he was not attempting to move Mr. Putin out of power, but his actions were directed at the leadership of the Ministry of Defense. His mutiny, of course, got resolved peacefully. He is moved to Belarus with some of his fighters, and the rest of them, those who have not signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense, have gone to their respective homes, I assume, without any cases against them. Then, of course, we have Sergei Shoigu, who is the main sort of target of Mr. Prigozhin's diatribes. Mr. Shoigu is a politician of long standing in Russia. He's born in 1955. He, in Yeltsin years, he was the head of the Ministry of Emergency Situations. Uh, he is a full-fledged, in 2004, he became a full-fledged army general and was till 2012 heading the Ministry of, well, what we would call disaster management. And in 2012, he moved on to become the head of the Ministry of Defense and is there till date. Then, of course, you have the Chief of Staff, Valery Gerasimov, who was another target of Mr. Prigozhin's diatribes, who continues to right now be the Chief of Staff, as well as he is the one who is in charge of the operations in Ukraine. Uh, then one of the less sort of seen actors, one is of course General Sergei Surovkin, 1966, born much younger than the rest. He has seen a lot of action. His first action began during the aborted coup against Gorbachev in 1991, when he moved against the anti-coup protesters, and in fact is accused of giving orders to shoot, in which three of them were killed. There were a lot of investigations, but eventually they didn't come to anything, and he continues in the army. He has seen action in Afghanistan. He has seen action in the Tajik civil war. He has fought in the Second Chechen war. He has also been in Syria. And in Syria, in fact, he is credited with turning around the campaign and literally saving Bashar Assad's presidentship. He was appointed the head of operations in Ukraine, but subsequently he was replaced by Gerasimov. Uh, he is considered to be particularly brutal, but very, very professional in his approach to warfare. And then another side actor, of course. I beg your pardon? Oh, I can't hear you. You're muted.
I'll request everyone to mute their mics other than Nandan so that we don't hear an echo.
And finally, of course, we have Alexander Lukashenko, who has been the president of Belarus since 1994, who intervened into the crisis that was unraveling in Russia and helped both friends of his, both Prigozhin and Putin, to resolve this crisis. And now, of course, is playing host to Prigozhin. There may be ulterior motives in what he has done, but I'm sure that will come out during the discussion. So these are the main actors. Meanwhile, what actually happened was that for several months, Yevgeny Prigozhin had been speaking his mind, if you want, attacking the defense ministry leadership for lack of coherence in their Ukraine campaign, and in fact accused them of not giving him enough ammunition to fight the battle at Bakhmut. He became particularly volatile and critical in the run up to the 24th of June, uh, which culminated, or rather was triggered, the actions of 24th June were triggered by what he called an attack on his troops by the Ministry of Defense, a missile attack which injured many soldiers of his from his private military company. And it is then that they decided to take over Rostov
So
on Don.
Nandan, thank you for that introduction. So we have these interesting folks who are involved in this theater, fact, fiction, fantasy. We are going to come to that. But my question to you is that out of uh, all of this, there are three stories that are doing the round, three big stories. Number one, Putin wanted change of personnel and he did this drama to change people. That's one story. That somehow now why should someone as powerful as Putin as people claim him to be should need to do this drama to change someone if he was that omni powerful? That's one story and one question for you. The second is that we it was a ploy to move Prigozhin to Belarus, and it was a troop movement. It's and I find it a rather elaborate and expensive movement of troops. And number three, that it was actually a mutiny that was nipped in the buds, and it couldn't take off. There are three different, and there are some variations to each of these. Drama enacted by Putin, a mutiny against Putin which was nipped in the bud, and a very clever deployment technique, which I find not that clever. But anyways, so where do you pitch your tent in these three different quarters?
I actually don't pitch my tent at any of the three because in my book, it is not really a mutiny even. It is a private contractor fighting to save his business. On the 1st of July, Wagner would have gone out of business because they were being asked to sign contracts with the defense ministry, and they were going to receive orders from the defense ministry. So Prigozhin was going to lose the freedom of maneuver that he had till then. He was pleading that Wagner at least be kept out of the new rules that were there. So I think this was, in the grand tradition of Russian history, if you see, there have been these marches to the Tsar seeking justice. And this is one of those kind of examples. But of course, Prigozhin is slightly different in that sense. And
So now, Nandan, very quickly, what is the implication for this on Putin's special military operations in Ukraine?
Well, the troops of Prigozhin were taken out of direct battle in Ukraine on the 25th of May. They had done their job in Bakhmut. and they were pulled back and replaced by regular troops of the Russian Defense Ministry. So, effectively, if we assume that the Ukrainian counteroffensive began on the 4th of June, there does not seem to be any effect of the absence of Wagner. But of course, now the Ukrainians, as say, they have not started their offensive. So then we'll have to wait and see. But overall, I don't think the Russian military will lose much efficiency, except there is a certain level of I don't know how to call this, but maybe ruthlessness that Wagner bring to the battlefield. And of course, there is no doubt that his fighters have a vast amount of experience, having acquired it not just in Ukraine but also in Syria.
Okay, Nandan, I'm going to just leave a question with you for later. Brand Putin, what does it do to the brand of Putin in his own country and outside? And number two, why is it that this incident has also resulted in Putin becoming more gregarious and appearing in public, meeting folks? There obviously seems to be something that has him shaken at least or stirred at least a little bit. So what's happening there? And I'll come back to you. But Velina, your assessment of what is happening, the drama over the last week, 10 days, what was it about? What should we be watching and what should we be looking out for in the days ahead?
Mhm. Yes, I actually stated very early at the beginning of the events that, in my view, and of course we have to await the details and more informations, but I still tend to stick to my main thesis, and that is that the so-called coup was more or less staged. Prigozhin is actually a pawn in the hands of Putin. He has never been an independent player in the Kremlin and in Russian politics. And of course, some of the arguments that have been already stated point to the possibility that he was pushed into the corner and he was fearing for the existence of his PMC, and thus he was presented with no choice but to make a move on MOD, on the defense ministry. So all of this I understand, but still let's just look at the facts from the Kremlin's point of view and from the point of view of a security apparatus that has been running the state for more than 30 years now. And if we take a look at this from this perspective, it is absolutely 100% sure that the security apparatus knew or has known that something has been in the making, that Prigozhin was actually planning to make a move. Second point here is that, of course, the expectation that 5 to 6,000 troops would be able to make a move on the Kremlin, because we know for a fact that who controls Moscow controls the Russian Federation. So practically the stated fact of Prigozhin being almost 200 kilometers near Moscow and being ready to make a move on Moscow is absolutely ridiculous, because he would have stood no chance, so in a sense, this is my second point, that 5 to 6,000 men stood no chance versus 300,000 troops from the National Guard that are actually directly under the control of Putin. Now, if we take a look also at the fact that there have been already conflicts behind, let's say behind the curtains, behind what the population was seeing, namely between the St. Petersburg and the Moscow gang or closest circles of power. Here, once again, Prigozhin has been instrumentalized as a pawn in the hands of Putin, who actually tolerated crossing all of these red lines over the last months, while Prigozhin was bashing Gerasimov, practically the guy who is in charge of the whole so-called special military operation. But he has been also bashing Shoigu, who has been the closest friend of Putin. If you remember all of these funny pictures from their vacations together. I mean, you just can Google and see how they were, fishing. They went fishing and doing this and that during their vacations years ago. So once again, the very fact that Putin has tolerated, all these moves and actions by Prigozhin in preparation of the so-called military coup is point to actually instrumentalization and point to certain plans on behalf of Putin. What would be the benefit for the Russian president? First and foremost, why should be a stage coup? Why everyone would say it sounds so ridiculous, but this is Russia, and we are talking about someone who has perfected actually the power play while surviving for more than 20 years, being surrounded by enemies and rivals, even from his closest circles. Here, first point, in my view, this has been the beginning, the unofficial beginning of the political campaign of Putin for the next presidential election, which is to take place on March 17 next year. He has been playing with the fears of his own population. The Russians are fearing chaos and civil wars the most. And second, of
So,
course,
Velina,
important point is invasion from outside. So once again, you see that there is a big benefit because the people will actually stay behind him because he prevented a civil war from happening.
no, Velina, I'll come to this in a little more detail. I'll come back to this point. It's an important point you have raised on the future of Putin, and I have asked Nandan to think about this as well. That what does it really mean? But let me turn to Max now. Max, sorry I kept you waiting. I was saving the best for last, so I'm now turning to you. Um, I want to ask you two questions. uh, what is happening in the American expert community? you know, I am I am actually more intrigued by what I read coming out of the Twitter handles from your part of the world than what is really happening on ground. So, what is really happening in America? America had a very proud tradition of Russia experts, of folks who had spent their entire life studying Kremlin and Kremlin politics and the language and the literature and history and contemporary politics. Uh, how is Russia today as a field of study in your part of the world? And what is the state of the debate in America? How do you assess the debate that is happening? And of course, I would welcome your views on your assessment of what's happening in Russia, but also what's happening in America in their assessment of Russia.
Sure. So I think I want to build off of what you initially said about the different narratives as to what happened with Wagner over the past week. Um, I think really that there are three. I would divide it into three different kinds of narratives that are slightly different than yours. And this will help to answer your question. The first narrative is like sort of the dominant paradigm among American experts, opinion makers, and they basically overstated dramatically what the heck was going on in Russia. So this was manifested very vividly in the Atlantic, which is very sort of aggressive, interventionist, has some remnants of key neocon thinkers. And Applebaum, for example, is a very prominent Russia, or maybe I should say anti-Russia opinion maker. So she ran an article saying that Russia was in the middle of a civil war. Another very prominent voice in this space, everybody on Twitter knows, is Mike McFaul, Professor Mike McFaul. He has very good credentials. He was, of course, a former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He's a full professor over at Stanford, and he had to delete his tweets because he said that there was like some big civil war which was going on, which was manifestly untrue. But that's the primary lens. That's narrative one, is that there was this major uprising going on in Russia. that Putin barely survived, that some of them were saying that a civil war had already happened. It reflects the weakness of Putin. You see that in headline after headline. That's the main talking point that they want, that Putin is weak. He can't control even his own country, and that this weakness will surely manifest itself in the Ukraine war. That this is both a signal of his weakness and will further weaken his power as a result of the political unrest. That's the dominant paradigm among sort of the smart set in the United States. And it's driven by sort of motivated reasoning. Like, this is what they want to see, this is what they were hoping for. In America, ever since the 2003 Iraq War, regime change has had a negative connotation, because it's so widely accepted that removing Saddam was counterproductive in countless ways. At that time, though, Washington, D.C. was openly calling for regime change. It didn't have that stain on it at that time. But American opinion makers of the kind that I just described, they didn't move away from their desire for regime change. They're still big liberal interventionists, but they speak about it very differently. So, like, you look at the war in Libya, for example, the stated goal was not to remove Gaddafi. The stated goal was to prevent atrocities against the local population in the context of the Arab Spring. We saw the same thing with Syria. The stated goal mainly was to help the rebels, to help the revolution, right? But of course, many of them in practice, what they really wanted was regime change in Damascus. It's not, it's a little bit controversial to say that a core US goal with Ukraine is regime change in Moscow, but make no mistake, that is in fact a key goal. And so when I'm sorry to say, when these hacks saw this 10-hour challenge, internal struggle, they leapt at the opportunity to describe it in the manner that they hoped. It was just sort of an aspirational analysis. So that's narrative one. Narrative 2 and 3, I think, are a little bit more similar. The one Velina seems to be advocating, and I don't want to misstate your position, but it seems, so you said that you think that it was staged. Some people might call that sort of like a false flag, that basically this was like Putin's idea, and it helps Putin, or at the very least, whatever happened over the past week certainly didn't hurt him all that much. So that would be sort of narrative 2, and narrative 3 is kind of the one where I lean a little bit more heavily, and that is that there was a challenge by Prigozhin, but it wasn't for regime change. It had absolutely no possibility whatsoever of genuinely challenging Putin's rule. It was largely a power struggle because the Wagner Group was basically being cut out by the
So that's
MOD.
more a Nandan position, where it was a loud negotiation of new contract for a private army. Basically,
Yeah,
the
I
reason of
mean,
existence of the army was being defended.
I do think that narrative 2 and 3 are more similar to each other than narrative 1. Because a lot of sort of the empirical implications of 2 and 3 are the same. Like Velina points out that there was no possibility, that Prigozhin was going to genuinely take the reins in Moscow. That's true in both narratives 2 and 3. I think that it's possible Prigozhin just didn't have a very good plan. The skills that he has used in around the world fighting, that doesn't mean that he's categorically some kind of a brilliant guy in all of his sort of initiatives. I think he probably erred. I think in retrospect he would have done things differently. I think that he probably did think that along the way he was going to get more support But in the end, I think he kind of looked silly, actually. I don't see this as, and this is, I think both 2 and 3 agree here, that this wasn't a major challenge to Putin. And it's not at all clear that whatever happened last week is going to weaken Russia's position in Ukraine. And I tweeted, I found an interesting sentence by the head of the Ukrainian military saying that indeed he didn't find any degradation whatsoever in the fighting capabilities in Russia over the past couple weeks. What we know for sure is that because I attach different levels of confidence, to these different statements. I'm not going to say Velina's wrong. I mean, I don't have high confidence between narratives 2 and 3. But what we know for sure is that narrative 1 is wrong. We know that the dominant sort of intellectual paradigm that came out of the smart set running from the Atlantic to the former US ambassador to Russia, that they got the story completely wrong. And I think that that is not at all surprising because the smart set coming out of the United States has gotten huge aspects of the war wrong all along. And I'm sure that you could host another event next week and we could talk about what they got wrong then as well. And I think that it's one of, but it's crazy because they're manifestly wrong, and yet in no way is their sort of stature as opinion makers in any way diminished. I'll just say this one last thing. There was an interesting podcast yesterday where John Mearsheimer was on Glenn Greenwald's The System. And that was one of the areas where they focused, was just that this group of people are so routinely wrong, but it doesn't in any way diminish their stature. And this has been going on since the Iraq War.
No, I think basically the neocons are back and they are controlling the headlines. And I think that's the central point of Max's intervention. And they are interventionists. They are also perhaps believing their own bile in some ways, and perhaps amplifying their own expectations rather than the facts on ground or reality. And I think that's something that is, and now, Max, for people sitting in other parts of the world, because Russian sources or Russian linked sources are completely inaccessible. All we read is what comes out of DC and London and other parts of the world. And we also see a bit of trolls out of the other side. So the fog of war has never been denser than now, because all we see is self-serving voices coming out of DC and trolls and hacks coming out of the other side. We don't know what's really happening. And by the way, let me tell you that I was also told that it's a great idea. By the way, I asked someone a question who shall not be named because it was a Chatham House conversation. That do you think it is healthy for you to be relying on EU and Ukraine and American military information as a basis of news? Didn't that happen in Iraq, and didn't that kind of lead us down the wrong path? And they said, no, the Biden administration has been very careful in providing us very good information. So I said, oh my God, here we go again. We are revisiting the past. But look, I want to talk about Putin for 5 minutes, where he goes from here and what do we expect as he moves towards his re-election. And then I want to talk about the implications of this war in Europe. As someone has, we have a few questions by Ramakrishna, for example, who talks about the rising right wing in Europe. And you saw numbers coming out of Germany, AFD. So this idea that there is a great European consensus to prosecute this war is perhaps not true. And we are seeing stresses and strains beginning to ripple through the continent. And I want to talk to Velina and Max and Nandan about that as well. We also saw the unrest in France, and a moment's silence to those who are suffering because of that irrational silence, the rising in the riots in France, and solidarity with those who have been hurt or who have lost life or property. But I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about that. Is the Ukraine war actually going to have implications bigger than just Russia's footprint in the continent? Is it going to have deeper political implications for the future of the EU itself? And maybe, Velina, we can talk about that with you. So let's first now turn to Putin for the next 5 years. Putin, the grandmaster from the 20th century, still has his A game in the 21st century, Nandan? Or do you think the chessboard is no longer the playing ground? He has to learn how to play Go, because it is Pax Sinica that we are experiencing.
Well, you know my opinion about Putin, so I am not going to delve into it in detail. But the fact is, currently, as expected, his popularity has taken I would say, got a little bit of a bounce, because the Russian population at large, uh, particularly those outside Moscow, in regional centers, feel that he has displayed qualities of leadership by avoiding bloodshed in resolving a situation that could have, and there are always, as Velina also pointed out, and Max was alluding to, that there are these fears in Russia of instability and civil war, and he seems to have avoided that without any significant bloodshed. Uh, so I don't think brand Putin is going to take much of a hit, but I do think that Putin will have to find innovative and out of the box solutions in terms of trying to reignite popular support for himself, because I am not sure that the Russian population is fully supportive of the war in Ukraine. I think that they may be resigned to it, but that this will get executed till whatever is acceptable as victory to the ruling elite. But I do not think that this is necessarily something that has a wide public support.
So
Uh,
there are questions of support for him uh, on this special military operation. He will have to find some ways to communicate with his people, but brand Putin is not affected by this week-long drama.
yes.
Let me ask you the second question. For we got lots of Indians, including some who have Anil Huja and others who have joined us, are asking. Please ask Nandan, what does it do for the India-Russia relationship? What happens if truly there is some weakness in Putin's control over the country? How does that implicate the bilateral between India? So that's a question very specifically directed to you, Nandan. What should India be doing at this time? Let me ask the bigger question.
I don't think Putin is weakened in any sense to the effect that it is going to impact Russia's bilateral relations with any country. I think outside Russia, the leaderships, including Mr. Modi, who had a conversation with Mr. Putin yesterday, so I think they have taken this in their stride, and they recognize that Mr. Putin is still very much in.
Let me ask you a hypothetical question. Your own experience from the 90s, when there was a big meltdown in Moscow, when Soviet Union was transiting to the Russian reality. Uh, uh, I'm sure countries have significant layers of engagement that allows countries partners such as India, Russia, and other countries who are important partners for Russia to sustain any transitions that may emanate. Is that a fair statement to make, that the relationships are multi-layered, multi-leveled, and through multiple touch points and can sustain transitions?
By and large, yes, but the situation today is slightly different from, let's say, 91. In 91, there was a leadership ready to take over from Mr. Gorbachev. I mean, you had in different republics, whether it was Shushkevich in Belarus, Kravchuk in Ukraine, Yeltsin himself in Russia, who, when they signed the Beloverskaya Pushcha agreement, there were elites that were challenging Gorbachev directly. Today in Russia, you don't have elites that are challenging. Yes, I'm not counting the liberal lot, which has consistently this. You find even someone like Alexei Navalny
Mhm.
calling Prigozhin's mutiny a joke. You see, so even on the right wing, you find that people are not doubting Putin's control. So I think the situation is not, in that sense, comparable. You see, there are, as Max alluded, those who will eternally what I like the phrase you used, aspirational. They have an aspirational analysis that Putin is going to collapse tomorrow. That you cannot stop, because that really has no basis. But Mike McFaul and all are seeing mirages where none exist. But in my opinion, India's bilateral relationship is not going to be affected by anything that is happening between India and Russia. It will probably be affected much more by whatever is happening between India and US.
Hmm. Great. So now let me invite those who are watching, who have joined us online, to please send in their questions to us on the chat box, and I'll try to bring some of those in. I've already got a couple of them into this conversation, but now I want to bring in others as well. So please write in to us, and we will bring them in. Let me now turn to the Velina. I want to talk to you. Your prognosis on the future of Putin at home and across the continent.
Um, the way I see it right now, and I actually agree with most of what my Indian colleague already said, so I will not repeat it. I will just take on from there. And I would say that, like I actually said at the beginning, that this stage coup was the perfect, let's say, setting the perfect scene for the preparation of the presidential campaign. But in reality, the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian troops that has just begun, but is going to take place at least in the next 6 to 10 weeks at least. So we are going to have a very, very hot, literally hot summer in terms of military developments in Ukraine. And this is going to be the main factor on which the fate of Putin is going to depend, not only election, but also in the next several years. So the way how Ukraine will manage this counteroffensive, whether it will succeed to further regain territories like it did in the first and the second phase, that means with the Kiev counteroffensive and then with Kherson and Kharkiv. So this is the decisive moment, not
No, but
an
how sure
intra-circle.
is how Velina? How sure is EU? I have a question from Sunur. The rush to funding the rebuilding. We are talking about rebuilding of Ukraine, creating a front. You have investment managers coming in. How sure? I mean, what is the certainty, and what is the underlying reality that is driving EU to believe that we are at the end of the conflict and that the counteroffensive is going to prevail? That seems to be now preparation for the next stage, which is of rebuilding Ukraine. In your assessment, as someone who's not necessarily towing the thinking coming out of investment banks and capitals, how where do you see the state of play? You see 8 to 10 weeks of hot conflict. Are we going to see like a detente? Are we going to see a 10-year long prolonged off and on conflict like Iran and Iraq at some point in the last century? Or are we going to see a formal a line drawn where actually Ukraine has to cede certain territory? Because right now the debate in Europe is that we want that we'll support Ukraine to decide everything, and Ukraine has clearly said they want Crimea as well. So Ukraine wants to go back 8 years or 9 years and bring the ceasefire to that particular point of time. So in your view, what is the real EU expectation uh, uh, after these 8-10 weeks of hot conflict? And what are the couple of scenarios that emerge in your mind?
In my own scenario, we are already in the war of attrition. And obviously, short term, I expect that around October, November, there will be a strong push coming from the West, by the way, from the United States, but also from European capitals, in the direction of some sort of negotiations. We are going to have a very, very important election year next year here in Europe, the European Parliament, several European states facing elections, as I said, Russia, but also United States. So there is going to be an external pressure for some kind of negotiations, which is why I said that the window will be closing from Ukraine's perspective, will be closing probably around October to create more facts on the ground so that they can actually proceed with some sort of first rounds of negotiations, which, by the way, will also serve Putin in a sense that he needs also some kind of a calm phase before the election is taking place in Russia. But this war has the recipe for a war of attrition that can go on for the next 10 years for sure as well. So it will very much also depend on the will to fight coming from both sides, from Ukraine and Russia. Right now, the way I see it is that
Look,
neither Russia
Velina, I
nor
have to
Ukraine
interrupt
want to
you.
give
I
up.
have to interrupt you. Look, salute and full marks to Ukrainians who are courageously responding to the challenge. But more than the will to fight, the ability to fight is sustained by EU and American support, mainly American support. I think the question here is what is the will in Washington, D.C. to continue to have that very expensive and intense support that they are today sustaining? So I think it's a question of them being able to sustain it. The Ukrainians obviously are committed to reclaiming what they believe is truly theirs, right? So my question to you is, what is the appetite in Brussels and DC, and mainly DC, to continue to fund and fuel and arm this war?
Short answer: whatever it takes.
Uh,
Right now, you will find in Washington, in Brussels, in all relevant capitals around the coalition that is supporting Ukraine, the very same attitude, no matter what kind of spectrum of the political spectrum the government is based. You're gonna find the same answer, whatever it takes. So right now, this is the attitude.
So, and Nandan, from the Russian side, do you think Moscow has the capabilities and the ability to sustain this long war of attrition? How is their defense manufacturing complex doing? Are they being able to sustain their front lines? Do they have the capabilities of literally, Russia is a $1 trillion economy up against a $40 trillion coalition against it. So, how long, at what point of time are they going to be out muscled? And Max, I want you to come on this as well. I want both of you to come into this question, but Nandan, for you first.
The Russians started the war badly, but I think they seem to have adapted, and the economic figures that are indicated, particularly the latest that have come out, show that actually the war economy has helped the Russian economy pick up a bit. Manufacturing has gone up and stuff like that. Now, assessment from experts, I'm not a military man, so I'll have to rely on other experts. The assessments are that Russia can sustain this war for at least another 2 to 3 years. So, if they are capable of sustaining it at its current state, and there I agree with Velina that we may have reached a point of where it's become a war of attrition. But the point is, in a war of attrition, how long does the other side have a capacity to sustain? And there, as I think Samir alluded to, Ukraine may not have the stamina to sustain this for 2 years. So we will see a difference. The only point that where I broadly agree with Velina, that the West seems to be right now in the mode of whatever it takes to help Ukraine. I suspect a lot will depend on what the United States decides is best policy in the run up to the November election. If they feel that it is possible to project Biden as a great peace loving person who has negotiated a settlement between Ukraine and Russia, and that this will boost his election chances, I think yes, then you might find a chance of negotiation possible. But if that is not the thinking, which it isn't currently, where the neocons are holding roost, as it were, if it continues in the same vein, I don't think we're going to see any negotiations. And the Russians are prepared till next year.
So, Max, over to you. Anything it takes, is that the DC line over the next years? And how do you see this war unfold? Just as if you're sitting there taking peeping into the future and seeing how it unfolds. And what do you think is the prognosis from your end on this?
Yeah, so these are two really big, concepts. One is capability, and the other is sort of resolve, if you will. Very, very important in wars of attrition. If I were to sort of put them in a hierarchy in terms of their resolve, Number one, at the highest spot would be Ukraine, because they're fighting for national survival. Number two would be Russia, because they do, but I would put them at two, which is different than Mearsheimer. Sometimes people say, how are you different than Mear? We do disagree on some things. Mearsheimer says that 1 and 2 are identical, that there's no difference in resolve between Ukraine and Russia. I don't think so. I do think that Russia is highly, highly resolved. I mean, Putin talks about this war as existential. His legacy, his career, maybe his life could depend on it. But still, there is a difference between Ukraine and Russia. I believe that that difference will merge, will get closer together if Ukraine continues its strategy of attacking inside Russia. I think that that is a strategic mistake. I think that it will make it easier for Putin to maintain a mandate of war at great cost to Russia, to continue to prosecute it for the long term. And I think that it could well lead to an escalation by Russia against Ukraine. This is another area of difference. Some people disagree with me. They say, oh, how could you say Russia will escalate? Don't you already know Russia, has blood on its hands, it's war criminals, all that. Without apologizing for any of Russia's behavior in Ukraine, it could get worse. Russia could indeed escalate in Ukraine if it wanted to. It could surely kill more civilians if it wanted to. And unfortunately, the strategy of Ukraine striking inside Russia, which looks a lot like terrorism, let's be honest, that could lead to an overall escalation, both in Ukraine and around the world. Number three, in terms of resolve, is the United States. I agree that the current line is that Washington, D.C. will do everything possible to help Ukraine. And honestly, who could imagine the Biden administration doing more, right? I mean, you compare this to 2014 when he was vice president and the Obama administration provided no military assistance to Ukraine whatsoever. Now it's like $100 billion a year, and he keeps reversing his opinions. Now we're talking about the F-16s and the tanks and the missiles, and so Biden is wedded to military victory by Ukraine. His legacy is totally wrapped up in that. I do think that there are important partisan differences between Democrats and Republicans. Republicans tend to be not as supportive of this level of US investment in Ukraine. That's not true across the board, but I do think that if you had a Trump presidency, or if the governor of Florida were to get the nomination, U.S. support for Ukraine would not be quite as reliable. I do think that the next 10 weeks are very important. Ukraine, as well as all these Western pundits, they oversold the counteroffensive. It was supposed to have begun, with the first, thawing or whatever, whatever, months ago or 2 months ago, and we waited, and it happened slowly. And then when it did happen, it wasn't really clear whether this is what we were all waiting for. I do understand that Ukraine has the luxury of having a number of important weapon systems en route, at which point I do think that the counteroffensive will benefit. I think that surely, and again, I'm no military genius, but I do think that the counteroffensive will be modestly successful, if you will. It will take some territory. It will a little bit more territory at a rate a little bit faster than what we're currently seeing. But whether they'll be able to actually punch through any front lines and qualitatively change the balance of forces in any meaningful way, I'm not sold on that. But I do think that the American public is watching. And there's only so much spin that the Atlantic and the Mike McFalls of the world can put on these things. You know,
Okay, so since I have
American
you,
investment remains really high. Ukrainian, fatalities remain really high, and there isn't substantial Ukrainian expansion in terms of their territorial control. It's going to be harder and harder to sell this war. And if a Republican comes in power in 2024, I think that Zelensky's really going to need to negotiate.
and Max, how do you uh, respond to voices from, and this is the question from one of the viewers, GK, and he says, and I mean, I can answer that question, but let me, it was for you, so let me pose it to you. Uh, what is the difference between NATO-US wars in 80 countries in the last 75 years and Russia's Ukraine war? What is the difference between the two? That's a question that he's asked you, Max. I'll let you answer that.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question, but
I think
I'll
it is
answer it
part
the
of
way I
the
understand it.
it
Yeah.
is part of the general sentiment in many countries that what America and EU did in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in
Oh,
other
yeah.
parts of the country where there was no respect to integrity and sovereignty, and they did pretty much both within and outside the UN mandates. How is Russia's defense of its own sphere of influence any different to those?
Yeah, I mean, the dominant sort of ideology in the United States that's not only seen among elites, but also among the general public is American exceptionalism. And the idea is that the United States is a fundamentally good country, that we're benevolent, that our interventions around the world are not only well intentioned, but they tend to have a positive effect. And so, given that belief system, all sorts of wars, including wars which massively violate sovereignty, including wars which are based on lies, and including wars which are disastrous for the local population, international security, and US national security more generally, they're not really spoken of that loudly. So a lot of American opinion makers, they often defend US involvement in Ukraine as upholding the rules-based system, right? But for those who are not within this American exceptionalism bubble, that kind of rhetoric, especially in the global South, can seem really absurd. And I'm sympathetic to viewing American exceptionalism as absurd, especially since the end of the Cold War. US interventions around the world have been in the aggregate quite unsuccessful and in some cases very damning. And that's true even when there's been NATO involvement. We don't talk very much about the Libya intervention, but we should talk about it much more in terms of fanning militancy and weapons and migration crisis and proxy wars and things. But most Americans, they don't understand that history. They think that NATO is a fundamentally defensive alliance. And so they view Russia's intrusion into Ukraine as kind of like a one-off example of a violation of national sovereignty, without understanding that the violation of national sovereignty was a key aspect of the
Was
war
a
on
business
terrorism.
model out of DC. So was part of the business model of the unipolar world for the longest time. But let me quickly, Nandan, there's a question for you by Delhiwala. He says he was in Krasnodar, southern Russia, in May, June, and he was shocked to see Putin's popularity even amongst the youth there. So the youth factor and the next elections. You were in Russia recently. You're going again next month. Uh, how is the young Russia responding to Putin today? There was a question for you.
I actually share his shock because when I was there, I discovered, and I was there early April, I was surprised to see the level of support for Mr. Putin amongst the youngsters, and I'm talking of 18 to 25. I assumed that this would be the anti Putin group of people, but it turned out to be completely opposite. And, I found that opposition to Putin's war or voicing opposition was prevalent amongst the people who were between 30 and 40. It was quite a surprising thing actually for me. So I can completely understand the gentleman who asked you that question. The Russians, in fact, that is where I will talk about what Max mentioned. The Russian resolve in this war, I would originally have agreed with his thesis that it's one and two, but I am more inclined to believe that the Russians are beginning to view this as an existential war, and they are also coming to the position of whatever it takes. And if you look at the kind of references that are made to the Ukrainians, who till recently were treated as a brotherly nation, and it's a pity we have to fight and shed blood and stuff like that. But now amongst the youngsters, there are very, very negative references, particularly in social media, towards the Ukrainians. So I
Okay.
think I disagree with again the assessment that the Ukrainian counteroffensive may not get what it wants, in the sense that it may get back some territory, but the point is the Ukrainian counteroffensive after some time is going to run out of steam. And I suspect that the Russian tactics are to wait for that moment and then push back. And that is when I suspect, and by Velina's dateline, about October, November, I suspect the Russians are going to be in control of all the territories that they have formally incorporated into their constitution.
Okay, so Belina, now we turn to EU. I think let's spend the last segment of this conversation on EU. There are a number of questions for you. The first question, Belina, does EU get it that EU's uh, uh, discourse and debates and discussions on the Ukraine Russia situation are not understood in rest of the world? Do they get it that in LDCs, and you were with me in Kigali, I was in Cape Town, I have met nearly folks from 40 odd African nations, many other developing countries. uh, they do not believe that Russia is to blame. They also do not believe that Russia's actions are causing them hardship. Their economic challenges are blamed squarely on Western sanctions against Russia. Does EU get this, or are voices impossible to pierce the bubble, the Wilsonian bubble that extends between Brussels and DC today?
Um, I will, of course, answer to your question.
No, but
But
this is a
first,
question that someone has asked from
yeah,
the.
to the
Okay.
question that is asked in the chat room. First point that I want to make is that Russia's war against Ukraine is the manifestation of a Cold War 2.0. We are already there. So it's not only fog of war that was already outlined, but it is actually much more than that. And this is something that Russia has perfected during the first Cold War. And of course, they have all the means, the instruments, the channels of influence around the world, specifically the global south. The global south, once again, will be this terrain for the information warfare. And we see that Russia is very, very successful. Sanctions would have not been launched if Russia
Can I
had not
interrupt you
made
on
the
that
move on
point,
Ukraine.
Melina? Can I interrupt you on that point? I want to come to sanctions in a bit, but I would uh, very hesitatingly disagree with you, Melina. Let me confirm to you that there is no Russian information warfare in the global south. Global south is very clear that the hardship comes from the EU through their own organic assessments. In fact, there is no Russian media present in what we see most is CNN and BBC and Western media. What we read is Western news. What we read is Western news wires. Please believe me, much of the global south, even India, only a couple of 20 odd million Indians are on Twitter. The point I'm trying to make here is that I think the idea that somehow it is Russian information warfare that has made the global South reach certain assessments on the absolute hypocrisy and unconvincing communication coming out of Brussels is wrong. The question here is, does EU understand that their own history and their own behavior with the global South is the reason why the global South is not with the EU? That's my question to you, not what
I
Russian information.
understand your question, but in fact, I've been dealing with the Russian actions prior to the beginning of the war. In fact, I've been covering Russian actions for the last more than 20 years, and I can assure you, in fact, that Russia has instrumentalized this very important dependencies, specifically those that actually hit the global South, such as the food commodities, prior to the beginning of the war, in preparation of the war. And of course, this means automatically political leverage. Second point, when the Russian foreign minister or the Russian political elite goes to meet the leadership of the global South, there is a certain narrative that is being disseminated, carefully crafted and disseminated. So, of course, the European Union and Europe stands no chance in this war. Right from the beginning, I said this very clearly, that the narrative that the sanctions are actually causing the pain and so on is going to pretty much win the information warfare. And we are seeing this very clearly right now. As we speak, we are in the middle of a looming second food crisis around the world. Once again, the Ukrainian ports have been blocked, not by Ukraine, by the way, in preparation of the upcoming second season. Why, you would ask? Because as we know, wars are inflationary, and this amplify once again the pain on the very same global South. Second point, when it comes to the sanctions, there have been, yes, 11 packages meanwhile. And in fact, Europe is pretty much also being affected by their own sanctions. And yet, when it comes to, for instance, food deliveries, fertilizers, and so on, there is no actual empirical proof that makes the point that the sanctions are actually hitting the global South. It is more about the European economies in reality that are actually now taking the hit, and we see the political result. The political result being that populist movements, by the way, not only on the right-wing side of the spectrum, but also on the left wings. We have, for instance, in Austria, for the very first time since 1947, since the end of the
Velina, hold your thought on
of the Second World War. Just a second. We have a communist party being elected at local level, so it's not only the far right.
So I'm coming to the right wing and the left wing in a minute. Nandan, you had a two-finger intervention on the food point. Go ahead.
Well, Velina, you're absolutely right about the food crisis, but there is a small nuance here. Russia exports more grain than Ukraine, about 5% more to the world.
It's
And
number one wheat exporter in
yeah,
the
it is
world.
number one. And the Black Sea deal does not allow Russia to re-export their wheat unless Russia agrees to Ukraine allowing the wheat, which is fine. But even then, Russian boats are being stopped. That's one point. The second point is that the Ukrainian wheat goes to Europe. It's the Russian wheat that goes to Africa.
That goes to the global South. But
Yeah.
anyways, we will have a full discussion on food. And Velina, let's just say
We
that
should have a full discussion on this topic.
that we in the global South have a different view of what is happening than you do, and maybe it's a good conversation to have with European and Southern experts, so that you understand that Ukraine feeds Europe. Russia was feeding the world, and what is stopped is the feed supply to the world. When the food shocks happen in Africa, that is what is amplified in their assessments of who to point the fingers to. But Nandan, thanks for that intervention. But let me go back to Europe, because this is the interesting part. Max, do you want to come in on any of this till now? Because I'm going to bring you into the EU question in a bit. Velina, you started a very interesting nugget of communist winning a local election. I want to just add to that my wife sent me an image which said 18%. Some polling in Germany showed 18% vote share of AfD, bigger than any of the other major parties. So you're saying there's a right of left and a rise of the right, extreme left and extreme
Both
right.
extremes, of course,
Yeah.
not
So
equally, not
now tell me, how
proportionally.
much is the war of attrition or the continuing of this war, the flood of migrants, inflationary pressures, and of course job losses that are bound to happen as industry begins to curtail its optimism for the future if the war prolongs. How much of the war is going to implicate European politics? We are seeing Paris is burning once again. We are seeing the numbers in Germany. You told me about the incident around the Communist Party rise in your part of the world. How is the politics in Europe going to hold up with this war? Max, my question to you would be: are there going to be regime change, but regime change in different countries, the ones we did not really plan, unintended regime changes? So, Velina, let me
Yes,
first turn to you.
this is going to be a very, very serious, complex set of crises that Europe is going to witness and is going to deal with in the upcoming winter. I argue that our collective political leadership in Europe hasn't been equipped with the skills to deal with the challenges. We've seen this in the first year. There was a very, very kind of, let's say, successful mix of institutions plus governments, because the European decision making process is very complex. It doesn't entail only the national decision making, but also the institutional one. The institutions tried to come up with some kind of collective response, but we are in the middle of a looming energy and food crisis here in Europe once again. And this time, I'm not sure that we will be so lucky. And yes, of course, I agree with you that the global south understandably doesn't share Europe's fears and Europe's problems because of the past, which is very much linked to the colonialist past of Europe and in general the West. And right now, the global south rightfully thinks that once again it should deal actually with the problems of of the developed world, the problems of the West, instead of actually tackling the own problems and the repercussions from a war that has already global ramifications. So in my view, the Europeans stand no chance in crafting
And
any kind of narrative. So when the global south looks at these scenes as to what is happening in France or what is happening in some other European countries, I absolutely understand that they have no understanding for for
look,
the inner political problems.
look, you have in the last few months, you saw that a few months ago when I was in Spain, my mother called me up very worried that, oh, are you okay, Baba? I said, why? She says, there is a some in France they are burning some buildings. This was a couple of months ago. I said, Mom, I'm in Spain, France is far away. But then I realized that that region is considered to be one, and EU is, because of EU, and that's what happens. India, there are like 1.4 billion people. Something happens in an EU, it becomes headlines that India is burning, right? So in my mother's mind also, EU is burning right now. So it's EU where this is happening. So in that sense, my question to you is that when EU continuously burns holy books, has killing of folks who are from minority communities and are of different color and ethnicities. Uh, what is the ground? How does Europe have the courage to go and preach somewhere else? I just want to know, what do they drink every morning? That despite living in a cesspool of mayhem, they still take the bully pulpit and lecture the world on how to live. And that's a big question. That is it's not just the past, colonial past. It is also the current condescension that people actually have a problem with. That you live in a mud pile and you're coming and giving us sanitation classes, right? So that's the question, and I want to really know that, does EU get it, that we are all in it together? We are all struggling with good governance, with good democracy, with good liberal ethics. We are all struggling with the craziness of the digital age. Or does EU really believe that its narrative will prevail on Ukraine, on everything else? This is a serious question to you.
Well, I think that the bubble is real. So this kind of thinking is very much linked to a certain kind of bubble of decision makers and policy makers who, of course, are looking at the world from their own, if you like, ivory tower. and they have little to do with, or let's say, the touch with reality is not really there. So I've been arguing, in fact, over the last 15 months that we will be hit by reality. There will be a significant punch in the face by reality in terms of the problems I've pointed to. I mean, the problems that we've tackled last year are here to stay and could be once again amplified in a way that we will end up with electing. Unfortunately, this is going to happen. The majority is going to elect populists who will be promising fortress Europe. Trump will look like
So rise of the European
a
neocon.
lullaby compared to this.
So
Pardon?
are we seeing the rise of a European neocon equivalent, a commentariat that has taken all the bad habits out of DC and are aggressively promoting a line and a narrow worldview?
Very narrowed, yes, very narrowed. And the problem that we have also is that the complexity is real. The complexity of this reality is real. As you pointed out, we are all in this together, but everyone is looking for individual decisions and simple answers. We won't find any simple answers to such long-term oriented complex
and do you believe that
problems.
prosecuting a Ukraine war that is going to cause all of this is at some point going to make people in key capitals sit down and rethink on what is the new format of engagement that they must develop with, say, Moscow, right?
I was hoping that you won't ask me this question because you know that I'm always honest and I'm always straightforward. And I will tell you the following. In fact, my assessment points to a reality in which we are going to see a new Iron Curtain being established along the eastern flank of NATO from the north with the two new NATO members, Sweden and Finland. Sweden will join, in my view, this year or not later than next year, and with the Central Eastern European NATO members. So we are going to face a very new reality of an Iron Curtain, of isolation, of a practically a new, as I said, Cold War in which there will be a complete reconfiguration. And I think that France and Germany are those that are struggling the most right now to come up with a new role in this new Europe and also a new global role. I mean, sorry, but the way how the French president tried to actually somehow save himself from an upcoming problem, and that is the problem in South China Sea and Taiwan, pointing to the case that Europe should actually distance itself from Taiwan and should distance itself from Chinese actions. For the sake of what? For the sake of the so-called de-risking of the relationship with China. So we have a lot of layers of, a lot of layers right now coming together. And I don't think that the leadership is really up to the challenges and up to the tasks to navigate through this, very, very murky times, murky waters, if you like. A final point on my side, and I wrote an article for ORF on that point. I very much hope that I will be wrong on that. But if I'm right with this invisible Iron Curtain, that means that once again Europe will be split based on actually the geopolitical interests and goals of the European states, because some of them will stick to the United States no matter what. No matter what, they will stick out of fear of being actually involved in a war with Russia. But then again, we will have countries like France and Germany, which will be struggling, as I said, for a new role, and they will be
New
against
balance.
any kind of Atlantic, Pax Americana 2.0, if you like. So once again, the global South will be somehow squeezed in between. But this time, the global South has a very different weight and a very different role and very different players. So it's going to be up to those who will take the leadership role in the global South to create a counter narrative stronger than the narratives coming from the United States and Europe this time, because nobody wants to get caught in another Cold War. Nobody wants binary choices, picking sides between only two options, such as the one of the Americans and the one of China, and nothing in between. And I think that Russia's decision to make a move on Ukraine and to really try to subjugate and take all of it is a manifestation of exactly this consideration, namely that Russia wants a pole position. Russia wants to be the big, wild card in this newly emerging equation. Russia wants to capitalize on this newly emerging conflict. It has a very good relationship with the global south. China has completely taken the narrative of Russia from day one of the war, with the NATO expansion, with the oil in the fire. Sorry, if you remember, by officials, Chinese officials. So, in a sense, Russia has very good position within the global south, but at the very same time, it can also try to revive the Russian project, that not the
Okay,
Soviet Union, the Russian.
Max, you were nodding your head. Let me turn to you. You had a few thoughts on what we just spoke about. I want you to come in on anything that you heard that intrigued you, that evoked a response from you. Please share it with us. And I want to now let all of us know that we are moving to the last 15 minutes. This is a nice Hollywood size movie we have produced here, 90 minutes, but we are not doing the Hindi movie, which is close to 3 hours. We'll be back another time with a couple of interesting ideas that have been thrown up this time around, and we'll bring you all back to have a second edition of this conversation to take that forward. But Max, your responses. There are also questions on Turkey won't let Sweden be part of NATO. So maybe a future of NATO. Max, what is the future of NATO going to look like from an American perspective? There is also a question for Nandan that is it Nandan? The question is to Nandan that he's also a Malayali like you, and is that bias preventing you to see Russian action in the right light? So, but Max, first to you.
I do agree. That we have very interesting geopolitical times. We haven't talked that much about China and
No, we'll
how
come to
that.
China in the next edition. That will be our next conversation.
Okay, but
Ukraine
anyway,
in the future. Yeah.
The China issue is really the fundamental issue in terms of making predictions about sort of the evolution of future major international alliances. I think that that the rise of China is not going away, and I've been really struck in the Ukraine war by how much more saber rattling I've seen coming out of DC, even over just the past year or 6 months, where the Ukraine war is now seen in connection to the rise of China. One of the big arguments among the hawks is that we need to be really, really strong against Russia as a deterrence for China. Just as the Democrats seem to be a little bit more hawkish than Republicans against Russia, the opposite seems to be true with respect to China. But to a large extent, what we're seeing in Ukraine, I think, is a prelude to what would happen if China ended up taking Taiwan. But it would be much, much worse, I think, because the Chinese are a much, much more important country in all sorts of ways, but especially economically. I do think that, and Velina could definitely talk to
No, but
this,
Max,
but
can you dive into that a little more? Because I think for the Indian viewers, but also from other parts of the world who don't necessarily follow the American debates, you have mentioned that there is a certain section in DC that is actually pleading for mending the ties so that we can work together and solve the Ukraine crisis, and therefore China and US need to work together. That's one section that is talking about the need to mend ties, strengthen ties, find a adult relationship that works. There is another section that says we have to be tough so that China gets a message so that they don't dare misbehave. Right? That's the point you just made. Can you dive deeper into these two voices who are likely to be spouting each of these lines, and what could be the motivations behind it?
Well, those who are most supportive of intervention in Ukraine, I guess the more sort of liberal interventionists, they say we should, be arming Ukraine to the teeth indefinitely for all sorts of reasons. But an important reason is to send a signal to China that if it makes a move on Taiwan, it will suffer a similar fate. Another interesting intellectual camp, which you alluded to, is more of sort of like the realist camp, which would say realism is basically based on making priorities around the world, recognizing that even the great United States has finite resources and that we really need to pick our vital interests carefully. They would say that, we're making a mistake with Ukraine because we have limited military assets. We are, getting rid of them at a time when we need to be on better war footing when it comes to China. And that furthermore, by arming Ukraine so much, we're exacerbating relations with Russia, which will be a very important swing country when it comes to any future war with China. That, if anything, the United States should be looking ahead, recognizing that China is the real threat to
Mhm.
American hegemony around the world. Um, Keep, holding on to our weapons that we may need or that Taiwan may need, and that we shouldn't force Russia into the Chinese camp. So there are certainly realists who think that. Um, Politically, I'm in sort of nowhere's land because the Democratic Party seems very hawkish, in my opinion, on supporting Ukraine. The Republican Party, in my opinion, seems very hawkish in terms of supporting Taiwan. And I'm dovish across both conflicts. I think that all of this saber rattling against China is not going to have the intended effect of dissuading a move on Taiwan. I think that if anything, it will reinforce the view that the United States is over like hyper aggressive, and that the Chinese, they need to regard the United States as a true adversary. I would like the United States to tone down its rhetoric over China, and I would like there to be more talk about finding a settlement with between Russia and Ukraine now. I don't want to wait until October or November. I am of the opinion that the war in Ukraine could get actually substantially worse, that it could actually spiral. We need to make sure that it stays in Ukraine. And so, yeah, I'm
So,
just a
Max,
dump
thank
across
you.
the board.
Thank you for that. Let me just quickly ask you a question that I had asked Velina. What is the American discussion or the discussion in your part of the world, in your uh, group of folks, academia, and media on what's happening in the EU? How bothered are people about the European politics? What's happening in France? What happened in Sweden? The rise of AFD, the rise of the left. Does the American commentariat care about what's happening in European politics, or that's little boy politics and they don't really worry about that? So what's happening? What is the discussion in DC on the future of the EU?
I've been struck by the paucity of coverage of what's going on in France. I mean, there was so much attention on what was going on in Russia. Opinion makers quick to call that a civil war. Clearly, Macron's hold on that country is in greater jeopardy than Putin's was over the past couple weeks. I do think that there's a very real concern, especially among American academics, about the rise of right wing extremism. And so, to the extent that those movements gain traction in European countries, that's an issue which comes up relatively frequently. I mean, maybe Velina can add more to this, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Front National and Le Pen, they make gains in France over sort of this backlash against migrants and minorities. That kind of a story would certainly be of interest in the United States because it could be tied back into
I
the
mean, that's
American
because
polity and the rise of Trump.
the left-leaning media finds common cause with what's happening in Europe there. So in that sense, for them, it is a matter of concern, and they would highlight that particular development. It kind of fits into their own discussion.
And they would draw direct parallels
Correct.
between right wing movements that are rising in Europe and even mainstream GOP candidates in order to delegitimize them.
Um, so my point is, Nandan, you've heard Max, you've heard Belina, your final take on what's happening in EU. Uh, uh, is Russia watching what is happening in EU? Is Russia hoping for a miracle in the EU that there are regime changes there before the stresses at home begin to turn the wheels in the Kremlin? So how is what are the conversations Russia is having about the state of the world play? There, I mean, beyond the Lavrov rhetoric, which is designed for prime time and his prime time, not anyone else's, because I don't think anyone is watching him otherwise. But beyond that rhetoric, how is Russia? What is the conversation amongst the Russian academics on the state of play in EU and NATO and the US?
Actually, it's remarkably sympathetic in the sense the Russians, at least within the scholarly community, the strategic community, do not want to see a divided Europe. Surprising as it may sound, they are not looking forth to regime changes too rapidly in Europe, because their worry is that an unstable Europe will become a bigger playground for the Americans. And since they already know that Poland and the Baltics are a designate kind of fifth column within the EU, they don't want that situation to get worse. But yes, there is.
Are you saying that Russia wants to somehow wants a Europe that somehow finds the importance of Berlin and Paris like it always did? Is that what you're saying?
Partly true, but also I think the Russians want a Europe that is starts looking after its own interests. Because right now, if you look at it, I mean, you're in Germany. If you talk to the Germans, they feel that they've given up their economy, they've given up their security, and they don't have a say in anything. If you talk to a German industrialist, he's quite at a loss as to what is happening in his own country or with his own political class. So the point I'm making here is that the Russians are currently involved in a war. The focus is on that war. But yes, they do not want a divided world. They think there are enough problems in the world with the divisions that exist as they are.
And what about this uh, NATO expansion, Turkey, Sweden, etc.? Russia and Turkey have a relationship as well. And how is that playing out? How is
that
NATO
the
as a
Turks that the Turks will play both sides is something the Russians are very clear about. They understand that they don't have an alliance with the Turks, that as long as the Turks find it beneficial to have a relationship with Russia, that is all that the Turks are interested in. So they're very, very realistic about it. They also understand that there is very little to stop Sweden from joining NATO. I mean, there will always be a price that the Turks will negotiate.
Great. So I think that brings us to the end of a fantastic 90 minutes with all of you. I want to thank you. I want to thank Max Velina from Austria, Max from the US, and of course London and Delhi, and of course I am sitting in Germany. Four different parts of the world. We tried to bring together a conversation that could look at what's happening in Russia, who were the actors, what is it going to do to the future. And I think the general view of the House is that the war is likely to last, it's likely to prolong, it could intensify before it gets better. It is also the general sense that very difficult for nations who are committed, the US, EU, and Russia, to dramatically alter course at this particular point of time, which means the cycle of conflict is likely to be fed in the days ahead. Ukraine obviously is the most aggrieved actor, battling to protect and reclaim what belongs to it, while the other three are, of course, driven equally by security concerns, geopolitical postures, and questions of the future of the region and indeed of the world. We did not delve into China this time, but I promise you we'll be back again next time with someone who specializes on China and on Russia, and we will have a few faces from this round as well. So we will reach out to all of you once again. Do join us for the next conversation on the road from Moscow. Uh, Not because the road from Moscow is someone that many of us will is a road that many of us will want to take, but it does matter to all of us where that road leads, and we are going to try to decipher as we head into a very crucial 2024 election years in India, election years in for the EU Parliament, election years for the US, uh, uh, how
As Russia.
and of course Russia itself. There seems to be again a sense that Putin is likely to fight, and what happened last week could have been the beginning of his election campaign, as one of our panelists suggested. So lots to look forward to on this issue and many others, and we will know more about what's happening in Europe as well. Perhaps a little bit more on the ongoings on the going ons in NATO. So thank you once again for joining us. Let me request our team to also close the broadcast now and thank all the guests for their wonderful contributions. Thank you so much, Max, Nandan, and Velina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.